In this presentation, I'd like to take time to walk through a discussion of conflict within the organization and congregation, talking about the elements, particularly of conflict styles, and how leaders within churches and organizations can pay attention to their own approach to conflict as they seek to lead effectively within the midst of conflict. Now, conflict is one of those elements in the life of organizations and churches that is somewhat of an inevitability. Just like change, conflict joins with change in being one of those regular parts of organizational life. Anytime you pull people together in the form of groups and teams and organizations. And like some people jokingly say, themes such as death and taxes are inevitable, so it is with conflict and change. Well, we want to learn and pay attention to approaches to leading well in the midst of conflict. Now, we've been spending time already reflecting on some important elements associated with leader formation and how a leader develops personally and how that can help give them a better place out of which they can lead effectively through conflict. We're going to take some time to address some various elements. One of the models that I use in a discussion of conflict really is just more of a metaphor of sorts, and that is the image of having to ascend the mountain of conflict. And it's a lot of work, just like ascending a mountain such as this one in the image here, an image of Mount Hood. It is difficult. It is difficult work to pay attention to what kinds of conflict styles you have in your own life, how to engage in strategies that work towards resolution, and then for Christians, really a higher call of working towards reconciliation. We're going to kind of pay attention to a number of these themes, but special attention to the discussion around conflict styles. Now, I would argue that just as any journey out in the area of the Northwest, I grew up in Oregon, right in the shadows of this mountain, Mount Hood. If you're driving around within the Northwest, heading any way east to west in that region, you're going to have to pass through the coastal range or the Cascade Range or the Rockies. Travel in that area means finding passes through the mountains to be able to go through these areas. Similarly for organizations, traveling in organizations means having to pass through the mountains of conflict, and so we want to learn how to do that well, paying attention to the various styles, working towards effective strategies for resolving conflict, and then, as noted, moving towards that higher call of reconciliation. Now, within every conflict situation, we cannot always attain that desired reconciliation, but it is a biblical call. It is a biblical desire to aim towards that, and so we want to highlight this as sort of the summit of the conflict process, pressing towards a restoring of relationships when possible. Well, we're going to transition into some introductory thoughts, and here paying attention to this concept of the inevitability of conflict. We've already mentioned that themes like conflict and change fall into this category. It's really not a question of if we are going to go through conflict in our organizations, but rather when we're going to go through it and how we're going to go through it. We want to make sure that we navigate conflict well. We want to do it in a way that is honorable, that is in a God-glorifying way, and is done in a way that honors the persons involved in the process as well. So we want to pay attention to learning how to engage conflict well, learning how to lead through conflict well. If God has called you to lead within an organization, then paying attention to how we are to lead through conflict is a critical discussion, particularly for those heading into ministry in the life of the church. I have this slide here that highlights conflict as an occasion to glorify God. One of the books we use in this course by Ken Sande, The Peacemaker, highlights 4 G's related to conflict. Well, the first G in this process is that of glorifying God, viewing conflict as an opportunity to glorify God. Now, that may not be your first gut instinct when you think about conflict, but how can we ask the question of using things like conflict, using difficulties in our lives, using hard situations, and recognizing that even in the midst of these hard situations, God is at work and is desiring to glorify Himself and is desiring to bring about good in our own lives. We are reminded of Paul's statement in 1 Corinthians 10. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, including engaging in conflict, do all to the glory of God. Well, how is God at work in conflict? What are some things that he may be doing? How does God use conflict in our lives to both glorify himself and bring about good in the life of God's people? Well, there's several elements. It's just thinking through your own life and your own context. How does God use conflict in ways that glorifies himself and brings about good in our lives? Well, first of all, there is the element of the personal and spiritual realm. I don't know about you, but oftentimes when I've engaged in conflict processes in my past, they've been used by God to help form me, to help develop me, to strengthen me, to help refine some of those rough edges in my life. We at Bethel Seminary talk about the importance of developing both whole and holy leaders. Sometimes it is the difficult seasons in our lives, the conflicts that we face, the differences that we face between people or in groups, that makes us recognize areas of growth and opportunities of growth. We are stretched personally and spiritually to press into these hard times, believing that not only does God use conflict to glorify himself, but in the midst of conflict, we believe what the Bible says, that for God's people, he is for us and not against us. Well, in the deepest valleys of conflict, in the deepest valleys of difficult seasons in our lives, do we believe that God is for us and not against us? Well, that's certainly the case for conflict as well. Even when it's hard to see through the pain of conflicting situations, God is working in our lives to develop us into whole and holy individuals, personally and spiritually making us into the women and men he desires us to be. Now, relationally, conflict is often used to help build and strengthen relationships. Now, certainly conflict can lead to destruction in relationship when done poorly. But many times conflict is an opportunity and an occasion for individuals and different parties to come together and talk about hard things that need to be addressed. It helps to surface issues that are embedded in the context of a relational dynamic. And conflict that is engaged in collaborative and healthy ways builds things relationally also. Well, God can use it organizationally as well. In the life of the church, in the life of the organizations we serve in and are a part of, and even our families as systems and organizations, conflict can become an occasion for bringing about increased health in the midst of those organizations and entities. Well, there are various types of conflict. When we talk about conflict and the types of conflict, we can begin with one that maybe is not overly intuitive, but it's the language of interpersonal conflict. Now, this is contrasted to interpersonal. Intra referring to within oneself. Sometimes it's not even a conflict in the situation or context of another relationship, but it's conflict within our own lives. Stress or anxiety or fear that is grabbing hold of our lives, struggling with issues internally, and recognizing that there can be a conflict at war even within ourselves. Paul speaks of similar kinds of concepts in the book of Romans, where these two sides at war within us, intrapersonal type elements of conflict. Well, certainly the more obvious face of conflict can take place in the interpersonal realm. Here we're talking about conflict that is between two individuals in the dyadic realm, or within the context of a larger group or organization, multiple individuals. This is often the face of conflict that we see most often in the interpersonal realm. Well, there are other types of conflict as well. Specifically, Lees and Kitlaus acknowledge intrapersonal, interpersonal, and then substantive conflict. Here is where the conflict, and the type of conflict is largely focused on ideological differences, philosophical differences, approaches to life, and organizing and ministry. These substantive issues are not necessarily about people and the relationship between people, or even one's own individual intrapersonal side, but rather ideas and perspectives that people hold. Well, in this context, we need to recognize that these various types of conflict have different elements to it. For instance, you can have an individual who says they really like conflict. Well, it may be that what they like is not the interpersonal realm of conflict, but the substantive area of conflict. I remember at one time talking about this dynamic in a classroom environment at Bethel, and somebody said, I really am energized by conflict. I'm energized by the kinds of interactions that come about through those situations. Well, as we talked further, what the person was really saying is that they liked to debate. They liked to exchange ideas and argue their points. Well, when you're talking about substantive ideas, say political ideologies or philosophical approaches to ministries or apologetic defenses, these types of categories of substantive conflict can be enjoyable for a person that likes to exchange ideas and argue for their case. But this same student that, as we were talking, realized, when it comes to the relational edge of conflict, the student didn't like that. It was difficult for them because of the interpersonal dynamics of conflict. Well, as you think about types of conflict that you engage in, it's important to start by recognizing this, first of all, might not even be about other people or ideas. It might be about a conflict within my own life that I'm struggling with. Maybe it's about the relationship in the interpersonal realm of the dyadic or group context. Or maybe it's not about people at all, but rather the ideas that people hold and how they're talking about those substantive areas of conflict. Well, we can talk also about benefits and function of conflict. Sometimes it's difficult to emphasize benefits when you're having a conversation on conflict, but there are a number of key things that could be identified. Dobson, Lees, and Shelley highlight 3 of these. First of all, emphasizing that in the midst of conflict, issues get explored fully. It is really easy for individuals within a dyadic context, a team context, or a larger organizational and congregational context to ignore things, to sweep things under the rug, to shove things under the table. Conflict doesn't allow that. Conflict raises issues and makes sure that they're getting explored and engaged fully and explored fully. In this situation, conflict really is bringing an important benefit and bringing a function that helps individuals in relationship and individuals in organization to not ignore things, but to deal with them. Secondly, we can argue that because issues are being explored, better decisions end up being made. So rather than just assuming there's one approach to things, when there is conflict, where there's discussion of differences, ideas get surfaced, and better decisions often are made because of that. The final point that they highlight is that people are more committed to decisions. The reality is when issues are getting more fully explored, people are seeing more options and thus able to make decisions that are better, there is oftentimes more commitment then to the decisions that end up being made because people have had an opportunity to express their ideas, to argue for their ideas, and even to navigate the relational tension that has emerged through that process. Now, I appreciate what Patrick Lenciani has spoken of in this area in his discussion of the 5 dysfunctions of teams. In that context, talking about surfacing conflict and the role that that plays in the team environment, Lenciani makes the statement that people do not inherently need to have their way, but they do inherently need to have their way considered. Now, I think that is a critical comment that Lenciani makes, that it's not just about people having their way at the end of the day. People who are authentically able to present their ideas, have them authentically considered and adopted even if they're good ideas, in those situations, if somebody has expressed their idea and the group or organization has given thoughtful consideration to that and then ends up going a different direction, even a person that does not get their way can still be committed to a decision if they've gone through a process of having their ideas explored and recognizing that a decision was landed on that a group or team felt was better because they had considered multiple options. It gives opportunity for groups and organizations to be more committed to the decisions they do make. Well, here's a quote that when I first read it took me a little bit back. It's a quote by Lees and Kitlaus that says, "The larger the number of conflicts, the greater the stability of the organization." Now, I come from a situation in my past that was a bit more conflict avoidant. So when I hear an argument such as the larger the number of conflicts, I would fill in that statement historically saying the indication of lack of health and lack of stability in that organization. But Lees and Kitlaus are making this point that when an organization normalizes conflict and allows conflict to be a part of their life as a community, it actually is an indicator of health and stability. You see, the real challenge here is an organization that or church that never allows conflict. When one conflict ends up coming about, it oftentimes ends up being the one big one that kind of blows up and ends up splitting the organization apart. Well, conversely, if communities are commonly familiar with how to navigate conflict, it is an indicator of health and stability that they know how to negotiate these things well, so that when a more difficult conflict comes about, they're able to manage that because they're not in a pattern of sweeping things under the rug. Now here's a bell curve just as an added point. This is a reminder of kind of the fact that I think that this argument of the larger the number of the conflicts, the greater the stability of the organization, likely is true to a point until it becomes what the organization is only about. If an organization or church or team or group or division in an organization is constantly in a process of arguing and fighting and engaging in conflict, well, then that becomes counterproductive at some point. But likewise, we need to avoid the earlier stage where no conflict has emerged. There is a sweet spot of health in between where an organization is understanding how to navigate conflict in a healthy way so that when it does come about, it is a normal part of that healthy community life that they have together. Well, here is that first step in climbing the mountain of conflict, as it were. And it's the step of paying attention to conflict styles. Now, your assignment in this portion of the course is going to ask you to spend some time paying attention to what style of conflict you have in your life and to look at it both historically and also where you're at presently looking to the future. Paying attention to that past, present, and future dimensions of conflict. Well, there are some basic conflict styles we can highlight: confronting, avoiding, and collaborating. Now, certainly there are other styles of conflict that we'll need to engage. Lee's book walks through additional styles. There are other styles we'll highlight in this presentation. But just to kind of simplify things up front, I do think that these are some of the main options that we have when it comes to styles of approaching conflict. Now, the Sandy book takes this approach as well, these three macro approaches, but uses the language of peace around each of these, arguing that collaboration really is about peacemaking, this center of the road approach that's focused on being peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers. And really there are two sides that a person or a leader can fall off when they are not in this sweet spot of collaborative peacemaking. First of all, the confronting side can be a peace-breaking approach, someone that is overly confrontive, engaging conflict all the time in very confrontational ways. The other end is an equal danger, but opposite. It is peace-faking. It is avoiding conflict and thus feeling like things are peaceful, but in fact, it is a facade of peace. It is a faking of peace. And Sandy argues that what we need is to avoid the slippery slope on both sides and stay firmly planted in the peacemaking areas. Now here is an image of going along the pathway of conflict. And we're going to use this imagery because we can fall off the road. We can drive off the road on either side. And you need to pay attention to, I need to pay attention to what sides can tend to be difficult for me and for you. For instance, we look on the left side and we can see that confrontational really is off the main road on one side and avoiding off the main road on the other side. The key in this metaphor is trying to avoid these pitfalls and coming back to the central area of moving towards this direction of collaborative approaches. So when you think about confronting and avoiding and collaborating, it would be helpful for you to take a little time to think about your life personally in light of these areas. And so I have a couple questions for you to ponder. And in fact, we will pause the lecture at this point and pick up a part 2 of it in order to give you a little bit of time to reflect. Based on your personal history, what has been your default approach to conflict in the past? Has it been more confrontational? Has it been more avoiding? Has it tended towards a healthier collaboration approach? Also, how is God challenging you to grow in more collaborative strategies in light of this past that you have? Now, just to kind of share a little bit of where I have come from in this by way of illustrating, my wife Tasha and I have been married for many years now. We're up into the upper teens in terms of our years of marriage, and we're very grateful for that. Hope to be following my grandfather's footsteps, who recently celebrated his 72nd wedding anniversary with my grandma, and it is a joyous thing that they're walking down that path. I hope to be there with them in another 70 years as they've kind of set a good path for us. But when Tasha and I began our marriage, we came from very different backgrounds when it came to how conflict was engaged in our family dynamics. Tasha came from a quite healthy family, and it was healthy in the sense that they could engage in conflict and conversation all the time because they had a sense of security in their home. There was a safety that they had, so they could argue with one another, and then it would be over, and they'd be enjoying dinner together and laughing and having a good time. So maybe if they had a tendency, it might have been confrontation, but it was confrontation that was rooted in general health within their family. My side come from a bit more of a dysfunctional background. There was some difficulty. Usually if there was conflict on our home, it was painful conflict, and it was conflict that I wanted to try to avoid in my home growing up. And so that was what I brought into our marriage relationship, the desire to avoid conflict. And in fact, I viewed it as really trying to maintain the peace in our home early on. And Tasha, my wife, viewed that as kind of a stonewall approach, not engaging issues. So we had to learn how to come together to this center point of more collaborative approaches. And thankfully, God has helped us work on that now for these past 15 plus years, and it's been a great joy to grow in that process. God has used her greatly in my life to help me grow in this area of managing conflict. Well, I share that as an illustration for you to begin thinking through your own history as it pertains to conflict styles. Where has God brought you over the years in terms of your family of origin backgrounds, in terms of key relationships that you've had, whether that be family or friends or in the life of the church or other situations, work environments? How have you historically operated in terms of a stylistic approach to conflict? And where do you feel like God is challenging you to grow? What are those growing edges He is leading you to? You're certainly going to be reflecting on this for the paper, for the class, but I will ask you to pause just even a little bit prior to starting the second lecture to think about where have you come from and where are you going in terms of conflict styles.